The year 2019 will be remembered for the wave of protests that swept the world, with millions of people protesting to demand change. Often those demonstrations turned violent.
Okay, so generally speaking, when a student of mine would answer the question about any such question, would answer with social, economic, and political, I would say this is the wrong question.
Right.
This is the wrong answer. Why? Because this is the answer for everything. You give me one phenomena nowadays, and I will tell you, well, it's social, economic, and political. Well, of course it is. Mm-hmm. But as you were saying, and as Dr. Sharkawi said earlier, we are going through a very particular phase in history, and I think we need to really pay attention to the spirit of the times, to the climax of the time, beyond speaking in macro terms about economic and social.
In other news, China, Russia and Iran are set to hold joint naval drills in the Gulf of Oman.
This isn't just a military exercise, it's a political statement. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most important oil artery. A fifth of our daily oil flows through it. 21% of global supply every day. It's a crazy amount.
It says they are aimed at deepening exchange and cooperation between their navies. This comes amid heightened tensions between the US and Iran. Both sides have been at loggerheads since Washington reimposed sanctions on Tehran last year after withdrawing from a landmark nuclear deal.
We start with the US imposed sanctions, drawing ire all over the world. And how long will countries wait before they respond? Well, it looks like a pretty loud response will be coming tomorrow when China, Iran, and Russia begin 3 days of Navy exercises in the Indian Ocean. And as I mentioned,
you know, these developments are important because they allow us and our public to understand what's the situation, the real situation with Iran. Often we have friends and allies in the region and beyond who are putting pressure on us. You need to do more on Iran, more in Iraq, more in Lebanon. The reality is that this joint exercise between Russia, China, and Iran is a message that these two powers, nuclear powers, are telling the United States and our allies that we're not, quote, going to let Iran down if you do anything against it. So the calculations now for the United States is to take into consideration that we're not just dealing with Iran, but also with an axis, a larger alliance, including those powers.
In our current news cycle, we hear a lot about Iran and Russia working together, particularly when it comes to Syria, and I definitely want to touch on that point in a moment. But first, just weaving China back into this whole discussion regarding this, the Chinese Defense Ministry said this about these naval drills, that it would deepen exchange and cooperation between the navies of the three countries. Of course, this is a very important area, very close to the Strait of Hormuz, of course, a major area for getting oil tankers from place to place from Iran.
UK is accusing Iranian boats of trying to intercept a British oil tanker.
There seemed to be no end to this escalation. Washington and everyone with a warship or regiment to spare seemed to be rushing into the Persian Gulf. I mean, wasn't the nicest neighborhood to begin with, what with Saudi Arabia and Iran, mortal enemies facing off across the tiniest of channels. And when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, they did.
The attack was launched from the north and was unquestionably sponsored by Iran.
Amid all the calls for de-escalation, Iran has now launched an unprecedented attack on the world's energy supply.
Having failed at max pressure, Secretary Pompeo's turning to max deceit, blaming Iran won't end disaster.
So I think that would be throwing Trump a bit of a curve.
do you see a day where the U.S. actually does have diplomatic relations with Iran? Do you ever see a future where the U.S.
I find that very hard to envision, just like I find it very hard to envision that we're ever going to have a normal relationship with Russia again. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. I mean, we had more respect for Moscow during the Cold War when there were commies over there. So ever since there haven't been communists there, we've been extremely provocative and not treated them with any kind of respect. It's a bit of a paradox.
We understand it's the first such trilateral exercise, and while Iran would be keen to position the drills as a message to the world, that they have friends, they have allies, China is a bit more cautious about doing that. And in fact, that's because China is unwilling to be drawn into the Iran-US conflict. And what essentially China wants is to be able to showcase their destroyer, the Xining, in these naval drills, and to also potentially sell weapons to Iran. So there's an economic aspect, there's a geopolitical power rebalancing aspect.
So what does China's involvement mean for all of this?
Well, look, China and Russia, but China made the statement, is telling us that we're not going to allow you to seize and control this area and isolate Iran. This is very serious. That statement is very serious. And it could be also that they are willing, China and Russia that is, to send some of their parts of their fleets or ships into that area, which would complicate things.
Great points. Yeah, really fascinating stuff. And, the new year, who knows what the new year's going to bring. It's like Happy New Year and and hopefully
let's
go to war.
And hopefully not the last New Year.
Yeah, right. Jim Jatras, I appreciate it. Thanks so much
John.
for coming in. Great talk and fascinating as always.
U.S. cities remain on alert after an airstrike took out an Iranian terror leader in Iraq. Iran is vowing revenge.
And President Trump tonight says he took action to stop a war, not start one. KCAL9's Randy Page joins us now with the latest on the rising tensions in the Middle East. Randy?
These are dangerous times. General Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iranian intelligence and military operations across the region for decades, a revered figure in Iran, today thousands mourning and protesting in Tehran. Iran's supreme leader vowing harsh retaliation and revenge.
And Iraqi politicians with close ties to Iran are calling for the roughly 5,000 US troops based here in Iraq to be ordered out of the country in protest. What makes this situation so dangerous here in the Middle East is that the Iranians will feel that they have to retaliate. Qasem Soleimani was a national hero, part of the military genius of Qasem Soleimani, however we may judge him morally, was that he understood that Iran cannot compete head-on with the US. So he became a master of asymmetrical warfare, giving money and weapons to proxy groups and militia groups across the Middle East.
And the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei tweeted that a severe revenge awaits the criminals who have stained their hands with his and other martyrs' blood last night. President Trump dismissed the threat, tweeting, "While Iran will never be able to properly admit it, Soleimani was both hated and feared within the country. They are not nearly as saddened as the leaders will let the outside world believe."
Soleimani's end was swift and shocking. Landing at Baghdad International Airport, he climbed into a convoy of SUVs, unaware that American drones were tracking him overhead.
And yet tonight, some 3,500 more troops are being sent to the region and others put on alert.
We begin tonight by reviewing the many protests that raged around the world this year, and we've talked about many of them right here on this show, often when the mainstream media has all but tuned out.
In Hong Kong, the use of tear gas and live ammunition became common. Each protest movement had its own reasons, but they were united in their demand for democracy and fairness. Hong Kong's protests began in June against plans to allow people to be extradited to mainland China. Fighting between police and activists have become increasingly violent, with police firing live bullets and protesters attacking officers and throwing petrol bombs. People are demanding less influence from Beijing and the resignation of the leader Carrie Lam. Bolivia saw its biggest protests in decades following a disputed election in October.
And we found that there have been parallels between these protests and often several corresponding factors driving the demonstrations. Among them, a feeling of exclusion among youth, the young generation, concern about the future, and anger about a growing economic disparity gap in many of the cities and countries where protesters and demonstrators have hit the streets. It's the same kind of fuel that gave momentum to protests like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. I was there at Zuccotti Park when Occupy Wall Street began, and I watched it not only grow bigger and bigger there in Manhattan, but also spread across the country and across the world. And likewise, today, there's a younger generation, what we call millennials, speaking out, raging against the machine of often oppressive and corrupt governments and the wealthy elite, the 1% that gets richer while the rest continue to struggle. From Paris to Hong Kong, from Lebanon to Chile, the anger is the same. In many of these stories, it started with a smaller swell of movement growing into a large wave of protest for better living standards, quality of life, and higher wages, among many other demands. And one of the key ingredients in this recipe for resistance, the dismay and frustration that the rich keep getting richer. In fact, since 2010, look at this, Jeff Bezos, of course, of Amazon, made almost $100 billion more. Bernard Arnault, the chairman of the French company LVMH, which makes all those high-end products like Tag Heuer watches and the various really expensive perfumes and clothing, he made $82 billion in 10 years. Bill Gates, who has donated to various, organizations and charitable organizations, made more than $50 billion in the last decade. Warren Buffett, almost $42 billion. Mark Zuckerberg upped his worth by $72 billion since 2010. And Mukesh Ambani, the Indian oil and gas tycoon, $30 billion. The list goes on and on. In 2010, the 10 richest people in the world had a reported total wealth of $296 billion compared to $822 billion today. Oxfam, the international human rights organization, reported this year that the 26 wealthiest people in the world own the same wealth as the poorest half of the entire world.
Were there actually more protests around the world in 2019 than in previous years? It certainly feels like it when we're covering the news.
Definitely there has been an increase in what we can call turbulent politics and collective action of the bottom-up forces versus the weakening top-down political institutions. For example, in Lebanon, it's not just about the rejection of the situation by those young protesters, but also a decline or a loss of momentum among the various political elites through different nominations. So we are looking at this global wave. It seems to have spread across the global south. Then if we add the French case, that becomes more of a worldwide phenomenon. But definitely, I think it's not just about the causality that we witnessed in 2011, where people were asking for welfare and social justice and dignity and things like that. But now I think we have stepped into a higher level, which is a rejection of the status quo, the political institution of the state, either in the East or in the West. I think we are now beyond the causality of 2011.
Can we say the economic order is driving this? Perhaps a rebellion against the economic order that has prevailed in many parts of the world since the end of World War II, but it's seen as just not delivering for enough people anymore.
Well, there are clearly some common economic aspects to those protests. And many of these protesters really mention issues that are really related to this global economic context and to issues that are actually related to the global financial crisis and its consequences. So it's really striking to see those common issues in countries which have very different levels of economic development, whether Hong Kong, France, and Iraq. And of course, the economic situation and the political situation in all these countries are extremely different. but still these crises point to some global issues and to this model of development that has been put forward in the past 30 years. Well, in the past they used to appear to be a clear path, following the model of one of the superpowers, and then this liberalizing model that emerged 30 years ago, and there were expectations within populations across the globe and very different political systems that would somehow deliver, and things are much more complicated. There's a sense, of course, those situations again are extremely different politically and also economically, but there's a sense that the elite is not really aware of the solutions, of the way forward to get out of the political and economic impasse of the past decade, in particular since the global financial crisis. And with the social media, the type of organization of those protest movements, it's very decentralized, and there are no clear indications of an alternative model. That's really what's striking in all those protests across the globe. And liberal democracy certainly is being challenged. But what we've seen develop over the past 30 years is not really a model of liberal democracy. It's something quite different. I think liberal democracy is certainly still the way forward for most countries, but we have to redefine those notions, and in terms of economic strategy, in terms of political stability, in terms of the relations between countries. Well, I think at least there's some clarity in terms really of the dissatisfaction across the globe and those popular protests. But the thing is, there's no really clear path forward. There's no real the mobilization hasn't led in any country to really something very concrete in terms of an alternative model or in terms of reforms. And now we're on the brink of a new financial crisis on a global scale, and we might see the situation deteriorate further for the working class.
All right, I think we've just got Marwan, 5 seconds.
I just think there's no end game for what goes on today. I think this is the nature and the spirit of
Right.
our times.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid we are out of time, although it is a fascinating topic.